It's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Ann Georgehead, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you all for joining us for the Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture Series. Tonight, we're featuring author Katherine Howe and her book, Vanderbilt, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty, which she co-authored with Anderson Cooper. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. New York Times bestselling author Katherine Howe has authored numerous books. Her novels include The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, which debuted at #2 on the New York Times bestseller list in 2009 and was named one of USA Today's top 10 books of the year. She's also written The House of Velvet and Glass, which was a USA Today bestseller in 2011. Ms. Howe has appeared on Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, NPR's Weekend Edition, the BBC, and the History Channel. She's hosted Salem, Unmasking the Devil for National Geographic, and her fiction has been translated into over 20 languages. In 2015, she was the visiting writer in residence at Lenoir-Rhyne University in North Carolina, and she spent 2016 as a visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. She holds a BA in Art History and Philosophy from Columbia and her master's in American and New England Studies from Boston University. She's taught American history, visual culture, and writing at Boston University, Cornell, and Montserrat College of Art. If you enjoyed Vanderbilt as much as I did, you will be pleased to learn that she has several upcoming books, including her next novel, a true account of Hannah Masseri's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself, which will be out in November of this year, along with a nonfiction reader called The Penguin Book of Pirates. She's currently working on her next project with Anderson Cooper again, and it is called Astor, The Rise and Fall of an American Fortune. It will be released on September 12th, and I'm assured that it is available for pre-order or will be very shortly. Tonight's presentation also features a wonderful moderator. It's our very own Richard Clay, the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Dick is a prominent member of the Louisville legal community. He's a former partner at Dinsmore Shoal and past president of the Kentucky Bar Association. Dick is a graduate of Dickinson College and received his Juris Doctorate from the University of Kentucky College of Law. A lifelong learner, Dick also received a master's in English from Middlebury College just last year. I'm sure you'll agree with me by the end of tonight that they're the perfect people for a conversation. At the conclusion of this presentation, Dick will moderate questions as time permits. You'll note there are 2 microphones on the landing for our in-person attendees. If you're joining us virtually, please submit your questions in the chat. The author will be signing and selling her book immediately following the lecture in the lobby. Once again, thank you for coming tonight and enjoy the lecture.
Katherine, good evening.
Good evening.
It's so good to have you here. And this book is very hard to put down once you get started.
I'm delighted to hear it. Thank you.
I have a number of questions that I'd like to ask you. I think the first place to start is with the Commodore. Can you tell us what made him a tycoon?
That is a terrific question. Cornelius Vanderbilt is a unique character, I think, in American history. And there's a wonderful biography of him, which if you're a business history person, I urge you to check it out. It's called The First Tycoon, and it talks about the business side of Cornelius Vanderbilt's life. He was born in Staten Island on a farm, and he stopped his schooling at about 11. He was born around in the 1790s, I want to say 1792. Let's hope that that's actually correct. And his family, the Vanderbilt family, had come in the 1660s, had settled in Brooklyn, and then had moved across the Narrows. So most of you know that New York has a harbor. Manhattan is up here. Staten Island is way down here. It looks like it doesn't belong in New York at all.
I've taken the ferry.
Yeah, it's pretty far down. It looks like it should be part of New Jersey. It's all the way down here. And then Brooklyn's over here and Queens and then the Bronx. So they moved from Brooklyn across the Narrows to Staten Island. And the reason that Commodore Vanderbilt was called the Commodore, it started as a joke because his father was running a periauger, which is like a shallow bottomed boat that was used. It was a sailboat, but you could also pole it so you could get it into the Narrows. His father was running a ferry service between Manhattan and Staten Island and sort of all around. New York was a harbor town at that time. And so Cornelius Vanderbilt loved being on the docks. He was a scrapper. He was a big, strong kid. And he saved up money and he bought his own periauger. And so all the boatmen down on the docks started calling him Commodore as a way of making fun of him. And sure enough, he was good enough at what he did that he ran his father out of the periauger business, his own father out of the periauger business. And the rest, as they say, is history. But that was the beginning of the Vanderbilt fortune. It started with an 11-year-old kid with his very own sailboat.
And from that periauger, what was his next venture and how did he make his money?
Yeah. Commodore Vanderbilt is unusual in that he had two fortunes. His first fortune was, as we say, in shipping. So very quickly after the periauger period of his life, we entered the steam shipping part of his life. And you can actually help me talk about this a little bit because Commodore Vanderbilt was in a way party to a very important lawsuit. We were talking about
Gibbons versus Ogden.
That's
it's
right.
The Supreme Court pronouncement on interstate commerce.
Yeah. Briefly, there was a New York City or New York City didn't exist at that point, but New York State was trying to claim that there could only be a monopoly on shipping that traveled between New Jersey and New York. And so Vanderbilt was in league with a guy who was trying to break the monopoly. And so they brought that challenge all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was argued by, I believe it was argued by Daniel Webster.
Chief Justice Marshall decided it, wrote the opinion.
Right, and so in a weird way, it was Vanderbilt's desire to compete. He wanted to be able to charge less money. He was a master at just undercutting his competition left, right, and center. And so in a funny way, it's because of Vanderbilt's desire to have free and open competition in steam shipping that we now have federal oversight of what? Like all sorts of things. The freeways, airplanes,
Interstate
travel,
commerce,
all
transportation,
interstate commerce,
everything.
internet, all of that stuff. And then of course, his second fortune was in railroads. He quickly moved his money from shipping into railroads, and that is where most of his money came from.
Okay. What was his personality like? The book goes into things like he was a patriarch,
Right?
and he definitely believed in passing money down through the male inheritors.
Absolutely. He was I mean, this is not unusual he was one of the biggest Gilded Age robber barons of the day. And so he was not alone in his preference for primogeniture, which is to say preference for male children and also the eldest son. In fact, he at one point was quoted, I think, as saying that his daughters effectively didn't count because they weren't going to be Vanderbilts, because they weren't going to have the Vanderbilt name. Although that being said, he had a real soft spot for his mom. His mom was named Phoebe, and he actually owned her house, this mean little house in Staten Island for the longest time, and then he built her another house in Manhattan, but he kind of held on to her house. If there was a kernel of sentiment in Commodore Vanderbilt, I think that kernel of sentiment was attached to his mother. But his mother was a sharp person herself. So.
Tell us about the Vanderbilt burial ground and the mausoleum
Yeah.
and where he put it.
Yeah, the Vanderbilts are all buried in New Dorp, Staten Island, in the Moravian Cemetery. And it was actually, he was buried there first. It was designed, if I'm not mistaken, by his son. And so it is this sort of grand structure that overlooks all of New York Harbor, from what I understand. And all the Vanderbilts are buried there, even Gloria, who passed away just a couple of years ago. My understanding is that she's buried there as well.
But am I correct? There's a requirement that to be buried there, your last name has to be Vanderbilt.
If I'm not mistaken, my impression is that Anderson's father is buried there, and his last name was Cooper, and possibly his brother as well. But I have heard that you have to be with Vanderbilt as your last name in order to be buried there. I've read that as well.
Talk to us then, and I thought this was really magnificent in the book, in the epilogue at the end. Anderson takes us up to the Empire State Building, and he looks southward out at the harbor and comments on the flow of water, the tide out and in and out. And what use was that made in the epilogue as a symbol of this book and of the dynasty?
I'm glad you like that image. So if any of y'all have been to New York, you know that the Empire State Building is on 34th and 5th Avenue. It's in Midtown, right in the middle. And it is still kind of very identifiable in the skyline, even as the buildings have gotten higher and as time has marched forward. And even now, if you go to the top of the Empire State Building, also I'll add that there are some layers of New York history under the Empire State Building, which we're going to be exploring in the Astor book, because the Empire State Building was built on the site of the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And before that, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, of course, was built on the site of the home of Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor, who reigned over Gilded Age New York society and who appears in Vanderbilt because it was Caroline Astor's approval that had to be won in order for the Vanderbilts to break into Gilded Age society. So there's this multi-layered history that's under your feet and you don't even know it when you're in the Empire State Building. And when you go to the very top of the Empire State Building, you have this incredible sweeping commanding view of all of Manhattan Island, and you can see the shape of Manhattan Island, and you can see the bridges that go over the East River, and you can see in the very distance the Verrazano Bridge, which goes over the Narrows, which is where the Vanderbilt family originally went from Brooklyn into Staten Island. And you can just glimpse where, like, the body of water where all of the Commodore's money really began. And of course, the money that the Commodore first started scraping together came from people's desire to be in New York. And in a way, all of his money came from people's desire to flow into the city, because the railroads all flowed into the city. The railroads all went veining out through North America from the city. It was our desire as people to stream into the city that built up this Vanderbilt fortune. And so that view from the Empire State Building seemed to us to be a really perfect way to crystallize the beginning of the story, and also the beginning of other stories, the continuation of the story. Because I think one of the things that really is so compelling about the Vanderbilts as a dynasty is the way that they are this symbol of what is possible, arguably, in America, but what is also so difficult to attain.
And how easy it is to lose it.
Right, yeah,
And
and
if
how
you
fleeting
would,
it can be.
Talk to us briefly about that as you're looking out from the Empire State Building.
Well, one of the things that's always been striking to me is, so I have to explain something to y'all. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, which is a very new city. And so when I came to this project, I came with this sense of the Vanderbilt antiquity, you know, and you have this sense of, like, if you've been to Newport and you've seen the beautiful homes there, the breakers, and you've seen Marble House, which are astonishing. And most of those buildings were only private homes for about 40 years. And in many instances, some of the grand Fifth Avenue palaces that the Vanderbilt money built, for instance, if you've been to Manhattan, if you've ever been to the Plaza Hotel, catty corner to the Plaza Hotel is Bergdorf Goodman. And Bergdorf Goodman was built on the site of Alice Vanderbilt's house. But Alice Vanderbilt's house was only there for a generation. You know, you had these buildings that were built with architecture meant to last for 1,000 years. And by 1929, they have crumbled into dust. And so there's this incredible fleeting or intangible quality to this unimaginable money that I at least found it a little bit surprising. For some reason, I was expecting great depth of permanence when I came to the Vanderbilt story, and I was surprised by that.
In the book, each chapter is led with a quote from the etiquette specialist, Amy Vanderbilt. And the quotes that you and Anderson selected, they really work beautifully with the material.
Thank you.
How did you happen upon that, and what relation, if any, is Amy to, or was Amy? She's long since dead.
Well, I enjoyed it because it ended up being a little bit of a wink, because as it turns out, Amy Vanderbilt is only very distantly related to the Vanderbilt family. I mean, I think that she is from a line in which, if you go back from the Commodore, there's a common ancestor there, but she herself is not a descendant of the Commodore line of the Vanderbilts. And so I found it amusing that the term Vanderbilt, the name Vanderbilt, has these glittering connotations of society and authority and wherewithal. And she turned that into her own kingdom, in effect, her own fortune, in a way. And yet it was also a bit of a fiction. There's still sort of a mythos that she was taking advantage of, which I personally enjoyed.
And I expect that in the audience tonight or watching via Zoom, there are graduates of an institution 3 hours away from Louisville called Vanderbilt University, with an athletic team known as the Commodores.
Indeed.
Who gave the money for that? What?
That was the Commodore. The Commodore did give the money for it. It was because, so Commodore Vanderbilt had a first wife, and at one point he ended up having her put in an asylum. I know, it's awkward. An asylum that is located, ironically enough, where I went to college at Columbia. There's still a room, or not a room, there's a little building that was part of the asylum where she was put for some time when she was going through the change of life, as it happens. I know. See, he wasn't always that nice of a guy. And when she passed away, he very quickly, as you can imagine, many distant relations made themselves available to him after his wife passed away. And so he ended up marrying a woman named Frank. That was her name. It was not a nickname. She was named for, I believe, a friend of her father's. And she was a much younger, very distant cousin. And she was actually younger than many of his children. And she came into his life, but she ended up, in a way, being kind of a wonderful stabilizing influence. Here was this grandiose, gruff, controlling, domineering man. His oldest son he called a blatherskite and a nincompoop. He had nothing but verbal abuse to rain onto his children. And yet this younger woman comes in and, as sometimes happens, has a kind of gentling influence on him. Frank was an unapologetic proponent of the Confederacy. She was a very strong-willed, rooted in her Southern heritage person. And it was actually through, and she was also quite religious, and it was through Frank's influence that the Commodore was prevailed upon to give money to what was supposed to be a Methodist university. And they ended up naming it after him, which actually bolstered his ego quite a lot, because of course he'd never gone to college, he'd never gone to high school. And I've seen some of his handwriting, and you can tell. And so from what I've read, he was actually quite proud of Vanderbilt. The connection between the family and the university did not continue much beyond his generation. But at the time, at the end of his life, he considered Vanderbilt University one of his great triumphs.
go to his son, William,
Mhm.
because what's so interesting, I think, there is that by the book, he comes across as a very stable,
Mhm.
smart man who grew the money.
He did. He was actually the only generation who did grow the money. But I think as far as I can tell, it was because of his control over railroads. There's a very famous, I want to say Thomas Nast cartoon, I think that was in Harper's Weekly, of Billy the Blatherskite standing astride the railroads. It's a cartoon of him he's got these grand mutton chops, and he is standing with his feet spread, and all the railroads coming in and out of New York are passing through his feet. And so he is the only Vanderbilt who concentrated on growing the fortune. Everyone else in the family got really good at spending the money.
But as I recall, he tripled it.
He did.
In about 8 years.
He did. But of course, part of that has to do with a happy accident of timing. I mean, we're working on this Astor book now, and of course the Astor real estate fortune grew in value by many thousands of percents, but they didn't do anything. They just happened to own it first. Happy timing.
Let's turn to the women in the story.
Mhm.
Because they are very memorable characters, and they're central to the book, I thought. I guess first, let's start with a non-Vanderbilt woman, and that is the Mrs. Astor.
The Mrs. Astor.
What is this all about?
Yes.
You know, what moxie this person had to basically invent a society.
It's pretty fascinating, and I definitely enjoy talking about it. So you're going to have to cut me off because I have a lot to say about Gilded Age society.
I'm watching.
You're watching. Okay, good. Well, here's an interesting question, because here's the Civil War, right? And after the Civil War ends, many of us are familiar with the process of Reconstruction from a political perspective, or from a spatial perspective, or a race relations perspective. But what does it mean to have an American society after the Civil War? This is a question that Caroline Astor, she was born Caroline Schermerhorn. She was from an old New York family, and she married into the Astor fortune. The Astor fortune was first in furs, and then very quickly was converted into New York City real estate. Good place to have a fortune. And so Caroline Astor, who went by Lena to her friends, she had it in mind that it was a moment to determine what could qualify as the best American culture had to offer. It's an interesting question. What is American culture after you've had this tremendous ripping asunder and then this awkward knitting back together? And so she kind of took it in hand to determine what would be good taste in American society. And then remember, this is at a time when most American art, American fashion, American furniture, it's all being made, American architecture, it's all being made, but it's all being made with an eye towards Europe, with an eye towards Paris, Parisian fashion, Parisian styles, French food. And so she actually saw, believe it or not, she saw the conspicuous consumption of the Gilded Age as a way of expressing a nationalist project, an American ideology of taste.
Stop for just a minute
Sure.
here, because you walked in Louisville today, old Louisville, a bit, or you saw it.
A bit.
And you went, as I understand it, into the Filson.
I did not.
Oh, okay.
I wish I had. I did go to the Derby Museum.
Ah, fine. Well, you were close by.
I got my son a Secretariat t-shirt.
The Filson itself is on 3rd Street in Old Louisville, and Old Louisville has the largest collection of Victorian Gilded Age mansions.
Oh, wonderful.
Outside of Boston.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
well, I'm sorry, I missed it.
And we can get you there before your plane leaves tomorrow. But and the Filson itself is perhaps the largest Beaux-Arts building
Oh,
in Louisville,
indeed.
built around 1901.
Oh, wonderful.
So all of this for your audience
Mhm,
fits in a context of what was going on
mhm.
in Louisville and Kentucky
Sure.
society in Louisville and in Lexington and
Well,
at this time, and up
this
the river in Cincinnati.
Sure, this was happening all in American cities all over. I mean, you're having it in Baltimore, you're having it in Boston, you're having it in Charleston, you're having it in New Orleans. Not Houston yet, obviously.
Well, that
A
comes
little bit later, a little bit later. But Caroline Astor wanted this to be, it was like a conscious process with her. And so, which is kind of incredible to imagine. At least I find it kind of incredible to imagine. And one thing we were talking about before this talk was it was also conspicuous consumption, architecture, clothing, food, having the best dances, having the most stylish theme for your party. This was also a language of power. It was a language of power for women, because men at this time had avenues for the expression of their will to power through business, through politics, through any sort of public life, public discourse. The Gilded Age, which broadly construed spans from the 1870s to the 1890s, it's largely brought to an end into the 1900s, but it's brought to an end by the Progressive era, broadly speaking. And at that point, it's before women were generally allowed to live a public life. In fact, the first time that Caroline Astor ate in a public restaurant was when she ate one time after the Waldorf Astoria had opened. So this is at the very end of the Gilded. She never went to Delmonico's or any of these famous Gilded Age restaurants. So private life was the avenue for an expression of power for women of Caroline Astor's class. And so Caroline Astor, with the help of her retinue, Ward McAllister, who's kind of her like right-hand man, they came up with some sort of sets of rules and expectations for people. One of the rules she came up with was you had to be 3 generations removed from whoever made the money. Conveniently, her husband was 3 generations removed from John Jacob Astor.
Go figure.
Imagine that. And that's one of the reasons that even though the Vanderbilt family had actually been in New York for a really long time, they counted as new money, according to New York society. And so they weren't received typically at the beginning of the 1870s.
So what happened and got the Vanderbilts into society?
Well, what happened was a very strong-willed Southern woman, believe it or not. One of the things that surprised me when I started researching the Vanderbilts, because I assumed that this would be a New York story. I assumed it would be an old Dutch story, and to some extent it is. But one of the things that surprised me was that each successive generation of Vanderbilts is effectively reinvented by a Southern woman who marries into it. And one of the most strong-willed and memorable of those was Alva Erskine Smith. Alva Erskine Smith, who married Willie K. Vanderbilt, William Kissam Vanderbilt. It was Alva. Alva was from a Confederate family who had then been brought up to New York, and then they decamped to Paris. So she had her girlhood in the Paris of the Belle Epoque. So she had her taste refined and developed, and then they came back, and of course, her father lost all of his money. And so Alva had all the taste and all the wile and all the ambition and none of the money. And Willie had all of the money and none of the wile, maybe a little of the taste, but let's be honest. And so they were actually kind of a match made in heaven. And Alva decided that
For a while.
for a time, that's true. They were a political match, let's put it that way. And so Alva decided she was going to mount a raid, effectively, on New York society. And if any of y'all who saw The Gilded Age on HBO, if you happen to watch that program, the character of Mrs. Russell is rather transparently based on Alva. And I'm going to take a quick sip of water and then I will tell you what she did, because it was a good plot. Alva let it be known that she was going to throw the greatest party that New York had ever seen. She enlisted the aid of Ward McAllister, who was Caroline Astor's right-hand man. Ward McAllister was a professional dandy. He was kind of a professional snob. He was a man about town. He studied all the latest food. He studied all the latest dances. He was the guy you called. He was who you knew you had to talk to know what was happening. I can't quite think of a comparison. I don't know if we have a Ward McAllister today, but if you can think of one, you should let me know.
Would Truman Capote, and we'll get to him later.
Truman Capote, I mean, one of the reasons he's in this book is because of the comparison to be drawn with Ward McAllister, to be sure. So first, Alva enlisted Ward McAllister, very important, to have Ward McAllister involved. Then she let it be known that her party would be thrown during Lent. So her party was going to be thrown when no one else was having a party. And no one else, so there was nothing else to do, and there was nothing else to compete in the press, because this is a time when the press was first, the sort of gossip press was actually beginning. There was a gossip magazine called Town Topics, which invented the blind item. I mean, some of this stuff is really juicy. If you're as big of a nerd as I am, you can read this stuff for days because it's so interesting. So Alva actually had an instinct for publicity, because she would let slip little details to the press about what was going to happen, who was going to be there, what was the theme. It was going to be a costume party. Now, when I go to a costume party, I put on a witch hat and I call it a day. But in the 1880s, this party was in March of 1883. In the 1880s, when you went to a costume party, you ordered away to Paris for your couture costume. So you had to plan it well in advance. And people went in these most grandiose royal costumes, the Duc de Guise, Louis XIV, someone went as a witch, which I could describe. Someone else went as a cat, which I would very gladly describe. And so she let it be known what kind of party this would be. Everyone was talking about this party. Now, in this period, Caroline had a daughter named Carrie, who was just out in society. So when you come out in society, when you're a young girl, you're not allowed to go out to all these parties until you're officially presented to society. And then you are allowed to go to these chaperoned and heavily choreographed events where you get to meet boys. Very exciting. As you can imagine, Carrie is desperate to go to this party. She's practicing her quadrilles. The quadrille is a very complicated, kind of like a square dance, that had many specific costumes, specific sets. You had to practice it ahead of time. You were assigned which quadrille you're in. It was very formulaic, a very structured way of having a party. So Carrie's practicing her steps for the quadrille. She's so excited. Well, then Alva lets it be known that tragically, Carrie can't come to the party because Mrs. Astor has never called on Mrs. Vanderbilt. It wouldn't be correct for Carrie to be invited to a party at a home where her mother has never called. And this is like such a masterful chess move. You can just see it happening. I wish I could see Mrs. Astor's face when she figured out that Alva had got her. And so Alva had to make a decision. And Caroline had to make a decision. And Caroline was very tenacious about guarding her rank. So for instance, when there was a kerfuffle over the opera house, when the Academy of Music was outpaced by the new money that put together and founded the Metropolitan Opera, Mrs. Astor didn't take sides. She endeavored to be out of town when the Metropolitan Opera opened because she wanted to wait and bide her time and see where the chips were going to fall. They fell with the Metropolitan Opera. Mrs. Astor supported the Metropolitan Opera. She was very political, but she couldn't be political on this one. And so she realized she had been beaten. She pulled up in her carriage one afternoon during the hours when Mrs. Vanderbilt was at home. She sent a footman to the door with her card. The card was delivered to another footman who accepted the card. And then Carrie was invited to the ball. And Alva was in. And in fact, they both went costumed to the ball as Venetian princesses. And they were observed in discussion at the ball. And from then on, Mrs. Vanderbilt was on the list for Mrs. Astor's opera ball that she gave every year. And that is how the Vanderbilts broke into society.
Wow.
Crafty.
You'd said at the beginning that there is an economic historian that you would recommend here on the Vanderbilt dynasty. And there is a distinction between economic history and social history.
That's true. Yeah.
And but it's not, I don't think that the social history here is unimportant or secondary. Because actually it's very much an American story.
It is. Well, one thing, if you're interested in the business side of it, TJ Stiles' book, The First Tycoon, you cannot do better. It's an exquisite book. But one thing Anderson and I were both interested in doing is we wanted to look at the personal stories of this family. What did it feel like to be in these truly extreme circumstances, these truly sort of bizarre circumstances that are uniquely American at the same time? And so each chapter in Vanderbilt focuses, is sort of a self-contained story of a particular Vanderbilt's experience of a particular moment. It tends to hang on a particular event.
But the word hubris, I think, comes to my mind here. And both Mrs. Astor and Alva Vanderbilt seem to have had it in spades. There's a tragic flaw somewhere here. What would it be?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. One conversation that Anderson and I had very early on in the planning of the book was, is Commodore Vanderbilt a psychopath? And it was not my question, it was Anderson's question. And it's an interesting question. I hesitate to apply contemporary psychoanalytic categories to people living in the past. It's not something that I usually feel comfortable doing. But there's certainly a specificity of character. There's a certain degree of ruthlessness that has to be present in order to achieve the kinds of things that he was able to achieve. And what's tricky is that ruthlessness does appear in subsequent generations. And there's a weird way in which the money becomes this controlling force, this warping gravitational field. It organizes relationships. It organizes love between parents and children. It organizes relationships within a marriage. It controls what you do and where you live and who you talk to and why and for how long. And it becomes this, its own gravity field. And in a weird way, and it seems like that should be the easiest thing in the world to escape. All you have to do is just say no and walk away from it. And yet it's not, it doesn't seem that possible. And so one thing we explore in the book is how it feels to be in that gravitational force field. And of course, over time, because no one spends money like the Vanderbilts, over time, the gravitational field gradually peters away. And then what happens when this organizing force that has defined this family for generations is not there to define it anymore? It's a weird, weird story.
Go then from Alva's party to Alva and her daughter Consuelo, because that story is one of control, I think, and misery.
It is a bit. I mean, Alva shows up a lot in this book, I confess, and it's partly because she is such a unique, specific person, such a unique and interesting character. Her daughter was named Consuelo after her best friend. And you may be familiar with the term dollar duchesses. So in the Gilded Age, American wealth was becoming truly staggering for lots of reasons. And European wealth had begun to peter, also for lots of reasons. And so there were many instances of American heiresses going overseas, bringing their dollars and looking to marry into a title. And perhaps the most glittering and celebrated of these marriages was the one that Alva arranged, I think I can say safely, between Consuelo and the Duke of Marlborough. The Duke of
Coerced might be a better word.
Coerced, yes. And Consuelo, you really feel for her. She's this little girl. She's brought up in this very, very intense environment with lots of extreme rules of etiquette and comportment and behavior. And Consuelo was going to be Alva's, talk about, your expression of will. Consuelo was another avenue by which Alva would express her will to power, frankly. She was, rigidly trained. She at one point, to give her good posture, had to wear like a back brace that forced her to stand up straight. It's really brutal and difficult, a difficult period of her life. And then she's browbeaten into this marriage with a duke that ends up being a very unhappy one. And what's fascinating to me is that for another part of the book, we read, Alva made notes for a memoir, which was never published. And in her memoir, she talks at length about why she would do this to her daughter. And her rationale was that because at this point, Alva, one of the other things that Alva does that has never been done before in New York society, not only is she the first to marry a Vanderbilt, she's the first to divorce. She's actually the first to divorce anyone, because this is a time period when divorced women were not received in society. Everyone told her to just look the other way on Willie's affairs, that's what everyone else did. That's what Mrs. Astor did. But instead, Alva decided she was going to divorce Willie. And so it was the pain of Alva's own failed marriage, arguably, in her mind, that led her to think it made more sense to arrange marriages between like-minded people who would then grow to appreciate each other. She's convinced that she's doing the right thing, that young people are too dumb to make this decision on their own. They need their parents to make the decision for them. Obviously, she's proven wrong by the failure of Consuelo's marriage. Fortunately, Consuelo and Alva are reconciled, and late in life, Alva ends her life living close to Consuelo, and they end up very close. But it is a really intense questioning moment, I think.
And not only does Alva divorce, she turns herself into a suffragist.
She becomes a very active supporter of women's suffrage. This was something I could not reconcile in my mind for the longest time. Like, how is this the same woman? The same woman who would do anything to break into New York society, by 1912 is leading a huge march of women all dressed in white with suffrage banners up Fifth Avenue. She's leading this march up Fifth Avenue past all the open windows of the grand mansions where she used to go to parties and where she elbowed her way in, where she worked so hard to worm her way into that society. It's a really fascinating pivot. And I had trouble wrapping my head around why that pivot happened until we figured out that it was really driven by her marriage, by the resentment she felt for the freedoms that her husband had that she did not have. It turned out that Alva's will to power was so strong that she was not satisfied to deploy it only through architecture, only through clothes, only through society, only through her daughter. She wanted to deploy her will to power wherever she wanted.
Turn now to Anderson, his mother, and her story.
Gloria had an interesting and unusual life. And I had not known about Gloria's childhood until we started working on this book. She was sort of made a famous case in the 1930s. So Gloria's mother was also named Gloria. Gloria Morgan was her mother, and her mother was a young debutante, a young sort of society person who ended up marrying Reggie Vanderbilt. And I'm blanking on how many generations Reggie was. Reggie was older. He was a playboy, and he was a brutal alcoholic. And the way that he met Gloria Morgan was that Gloria Morgan was good friends of his teenage daughter. They were going out to the same ice cream parties and ice cream socials and things like that. And so little Gloria, so the Gloria Vanderbilt we all grew up knowing, I knew her from the genes because that's my generation, but she grew up as a small kid. She was called Little Gloria. And so her father died when she was very, very small. She was a toddler when he died of cirrhosis of the liver. And so then there was this strange condition where her mother was too young to technically be her own daughter's guardian. And so there's this complicated kind of financial architecture in place to care for baby Gloria and to care for Mama Gloria that is overseen by a court system. And long story short, there ends up being a custody battle between Gloria's mom, Gloria, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. And there's accusations of kidnapping that take place. And this is all unfolding in the press in the 1930s. And as you can imagine, the 1930s is the height of the Depression. And so there's a book called Little Gloria Happy at Last. That's actually a really fascinating account of this. And one argument that the historian makes who wrote Little Gloria Happy at Last is that the custody battle unfolds, some of the events that unfold around the custody battle come right on the heels of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And there's this moment in time where there is tremendous attention to and anxiety attached to wealthy small kids at a time period when so many people are suddenly have so little. And so that Gloria's childhood ends up being this time of incredible uncertainty. You know, there are all these people who are fighting over her, and yet no one who really knows her or takes the time to show her love. And she makes an unhappy, very early first marriage, in part to free herself from this tension and from the back and forth between the people who are supposed to be caring for her. And it was a moving thing to have read about. I had not known any of that until I started working on this book with Anderson, and it was interesting and made me really feel for her, in truth.
She had a couple of husbands.
Four.
And her fourth was Anderson's father, Wyatt Cooper. Was that a happy marriage?
It was. From all that I have been told, they were absolutely devoted to each other. And he died at a relatively young age of a heart condition, is my understanding, when Anderson and his brother were pretty young.
Right. And take us then through Anderson's relationship with his mother's monetary issues.
Yeah,
because it plays into the whole theme.
It does. You know, Gloria is interesting because she came into life with a fortune, but she also came into life having not been trained how to handle any money. And she came into life with Vanderbilt tastes and with Vanderbilt access and with a Vanderbilt skill for spending, as far as I can tell. You know, every generation of Vanderbilt really excelled, except for the Blatherskite. They just excelled at spending money. And Gloria was one of those as well. Of course, she also made a fortune by her design work and her blue jean company and things like that. So she's a unique case in that way. And one thing I always admired about her was her drive to create. Even late in life, she was doing paintings, and Anderson had a really great story about how she was starting to sell paintings on Instagram at the end of her life. I love this story so much, and she needed, like, people were contacting her wanting to buy things, and so he was handling that for her over Instagram, and they invented an imaginary assistant named Monica. So if any of you bought any of Gloria Vanderbilt's paintings and dealt with Monica, you were actually talking to Anderson. Wow. I love that story so much.
And Anderson himself describes his mother in his eyes as the last of the Vanderbilts.
Yes.
What's curious to me is that he's so successful.
Yeah.
And so how does one define success?
That's a
he's certainly
question.
not poor.
No,
and I
indeed.
assume he's made lots of money, doing what he does.
He has spoken publicly about knowing or feeling from the time he was a child that he would have to work very hard, and also being at times grateful that his name was not Vanderbilt. And he's also spoken publicly about being careful neither of his sons has Vanderbilt as part of his name. In fact, I believe that he named his first son Wyatt after his father. And so I know that he has worked very hard to make his own name. As you can imagine being a young guy in your 20s, right, fresh out of college, and trying to make your own way in the world with that name and the level of expectations people would have attached to it.
Yeah.
It's much easier to he wanted to be in the industry that he's in. He worked very hard to be part of that industry, and I think is really good at his job. And so I give him a lot of credit. I think that's a hard thing to do.
There was one thing I loved towards the end where he is trying to talk his mother out of buying something. And he uses a wonderful expression that if you don't spend money, you make money.
That's true.
And she didn't buy that at all. I think
who among us has not had to talk our parents out of making a perhaps unfortunate decision at times ourselves?
Yeah. This has been great. We've got time for audience questions, but I can't, if someone wants to turn up the light so we can see, we could do it. There we go.
Oh, look, there are people. Hello.
Yeah, it's a little blinding up here. Where are the mics? Let's see. So they're up that way. All right. Brenna Cundiff, would you raise your hand? All right. There's a mic there. Is there one on this side as well? Very good. All right. So if there are questions, please just come on up and ask them. And Brenna, do you have any that have come in?
Yes, I have a question from our virtual audience. Steve and Sheila ask, what is the relationship between the Vanderbilts in New York that you were talking about and George Vanderbilt, who built the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina?
Yes, we have George is a Vanderbilt descendant, or was a Vanderbilt descendant. Off the very top of my head, I'm not. I need to check the notes. I have to check my cheat sheet. He did build the Biltmore, and we've gotten a few questions saying, why didn't you have a chapter about George and the Biltmore? And,
Youngest son of Willie.
Excuse me?
The youngest son of Willie.
The youngest son of Willie K.
Yeah.
Of Willie K and
Of
Alva.
Willie K and Alva.
Oh, perfect. Okay, yes. Thank you. Cheat sheet. George was the youngest son of Willie K and Alva. And yes, do you like how authoritatively I said that? And I do love the Biltmore. I've been there. And my favorite thing about the Biltmore, if you haven't been, is that in the wing that's designed just for lady guests, they had a wing for bachelors and a wing for ladies. And the wing for bachelors, each room has its own sink with faucets. But in the wing for the ladies, the sinks don't have faucets. They only have pitchers because it was assumed you'd be traveling with a lady's maid who would pour it and wash your hands for you. I loved that. The answer is we simply didn't have room for George. He and for the Biltmore. And if we'd had a little bit more space, we could have put him in there. But the way the book fits together, it didn't seem like there was a way to put it.
I have another question from Mr. Charlie Kane. He's a past treasurer and chief investment officer of Vanderbilt University. What do you think or believe could have been done to protect the amazing fortune that Cornelius Vanderbilt created? Why didn't he, Billy, set up trusts or diversify assets into other less liquid investments like real estate or other hard assets, protecting the funds from future generations?
Protecting the funds from future generations. Well, I mean, honestly, I don't think that the problem was failure to think about investments or even the failure to have trust. I think the problem was that conspicuous consumption in the Gilded Age was the way to power. I'm not going to remember the numbers off the very top of my head, but we calculate the degree to which value evaporated with the breakers in this book. The amount of money that was spent to build the breakers, to furnish the breakers, to run the breakers, and then what it was sold for when it was sold to finally sold, which it was only finally sold relatively recently to the Newport Historical Society. That is something astonishing. It's something like $900 million in value that just goes away, just vanishes. And so just like that.
That was well timed.
It was beautifully timed.
Thank you. Pardon me.
And so in truth, so much of it just has to do with, you look at, think about the house that was built where Bergdorf Goodman, you spend $100 million building a house that fills an entire city block in Manhattan. And then Manhattan, soon that region of Fifth Avenue is peopled with skyscrapers. You have to sell it for the value of the land, not for the value of the house. The house is bulldozed. That value is gone. It just goes away. And so honestly, is there anything, I don't think that the Commodore was necessarily in a position to anticipate the spending that would be possible, because I think that level of spending had never happened in American culture before. Now, what's interesting is that that level of spending is happening in American culture now, except that instead of ordering our crazy cat costumes from Paris, now billionaires are ordering their own bespoke spacesuits and are going to space. Jeff Bezos has just launched the biggest sailing yacht ever made. It's in the North Sea right now. And the amount of money that the Vanderbilt spent on yachts is a drop in the literal bucket compared to what he just spent on this boat. And so, I think in answer to what could he have done, I don't know what he could have done. I'm but a humble novelist.
Any other questions?
Yeah, up here.
Please.
Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. So my question is, ordinary Americans like me tend to think of people like the Vanderbilts as kind of a different breed, if you will, like a really different kind of, not even sure if they even fall in that same category of humans like us. So as you kind of approach this, even some of the ways you're describing them seem like, you're kind of describing them as something different. Was your attitude as you went into this kind of to make them seem like they're humans like us, or to really kind of allow that differentness to be the prevailing theme?
That's actually a wonderful question. And I don't know that anyone's asked me that question before. I mean, from my perspective, and this is my own perspective, Anderson and I came at it from different perspectives, and I give him a lot of credit first and foremost, because I think many people in his position, because this is his family, which is something that I was very cognizant of when we were working on this project. And I think many people in his position would have wanted it to be a hagiography. They would have wanted it to be a wonderful celebration. And in many instances, a lot of the writing about Gilded Age fortunes like this doesn't end up having an argument. It ends up just being like, look at that, that's crazy. Which of course it's hard not to have that position from time to time. But one thing that we were both very focused on was the humanity at the center of like, these are human people in extraordinary circumstances. And what does it feel like to be a human person in an extraordinary circumstance? You can be in extraordinary circumstance and still crave the love of your mother and not get it. Or you can be the wealthiest man in the world and still wish your father hadn't called you names. And so one thing that we were both very interested in was the human side of this otherwise rather strange story. What does it feel like? Little Gloria, Happy at Last, was turned into a TV movie, which we end up talking about in this book. What does it feel like? She's a person. Gloria's alive. It was on TV. Like, what would it be like if, like, oh, my Uncle Jim is being played on TV tonight by Rucker Hauer or whatever? Like, that would be crazy. And so, in a way, I guess I'm answering your question in an equivocal sort of way, and I don't mean to be equivocal, but I don't want to downplay the surreal qualities of that life. But at the same time, it was important to us to really excavate the human side of this story, which is why you don't get actually all that much detail about financial chicanery or machinations or the ins and outs of railroads and who owned what, because other historians have already done that in a really credible way. But what we wanted to do was to tell really affecting human stories about this family.
On that note, why don't you tell them the story of the Lusitania?
Oh gosh.
And the very brave thing that a Vanderbilt did as that boat was going down.
We don't know for sure that he did it.
So, all right, the
Um,
apocryphal,
There was sort of an
story,
apocryphal
yes.
thing. Yeah, the Lusitania. Now I'm going to get the year wrong. It was
Mm,
1915. Wasn't
yeah.
it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Phew. So
early beginnings of World War I.
right. Okay. So many of you probably know that an Astor went down on Titanic, right? And Titanic went down on April the 12th, 1911. 12. Thank you. Close enough. It went down. The Titanic went down. We all know, we've seen the movie, we've seen the end, it goes down. And it took an Astor with it. It took an Astor with it, and it took many other very rich and powerful people, and it was all over the news. And the reason I mention that now is because when Lusitania went down, so there were many competing glamorous ocean liners at that time. Titanic was one of the White Star ships, and there were other groups that were like the Majestic was also one of the White Star ships. And so all of these people, all of these Vanderbilts and these Gilded Age family people would go back and forth to Europe all the time, and they would ride on all these different elegant, well-appointed ships. And of course, there were also people traveling in steerage because this was a time period of heightened immigration to the States especially from Europe, from Italy and from Ireland, so on and so forth. Many of us, our families came at that time in steerage on boats like this. And Lusitania was a Cunard line ship. And so Lusitania had actually received warnings that there was torpedo activity and had ignored the warnings. They had thought that they could actually go faster than the torpedoes were able to go. I know. Or also that they'd be able to see the torpedoes coming through the water. I mean, some of the justifications for why they decided, but the warnings were published in the newspaper. These were not mysterious warnings. They were like, torpedoes are active in the Atlantic. Maybe don't go. But Lusitania went anyway. Well, Alfred Vanderbilt, who was the kind of head of the Vanderbilt family at that time, was traveling on Lusitania. And so it's kind of interesting. It's as if when Titanic went down, or when Lusitania went down, it was as if when the Twin Towers went down in New York, the Twin Towers had gone down and also had, they were holding the Oscars on the roof when it went down, like the level of fame, because this was a time period, the 19-teens, it was a time after the gossip press, but obviously before movies, or just when movies were beginning to start to dominate gossip press. And so society figures commanded a level of attention that we now accord pop stars and movie stars and things like that. So when the Titanic went down, and then the sort of immediate, just a couple of years later, Lusitania going down, it was one of the reasons, and Lusitania going down, obviously not by accident, but because Germans shot it down with a torpedo. It was arguably one of the reasons for the push for the United States to eventually enter World War I, because of the level of public outcry and the number of Americans who were on the ship. And one wonders if that would have been, if the fervor had been as high, if it hadn't been coming on the heels of Titanic. I've made that argument in other contexts before. But Alfred ostensibly gave his life belt to a second-class woman, and who ended up surviving Lusitania. And Alfred himself did not. So yeah, there's an Astor on Titanic and a Vanderbilt on Lusitania. It's really quite striking.
On that note, maybe we should close it with the quote that I expect a lot of parents have used with their children, and that is, work hard and save your money.
Buy low, sell high.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
This is
Thank you so
fun.
much for having me.
You bet.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.